She is the editor of two important, I would say groundbreaking, edited collections of essays on medieval magic, Conjuring Spirits in 1998 and Invoking Angels in 2012. She's also published an edition and commentary on John of Morigny's Flowers of Heavenly Teaching in 2015, and is currently working on Prophecy, Prayers and Dreams. Claire's title today is Intersections of Time and Eternity, Understanding Divine Speech in Late Medieval Angel Magic. Claire. Oh, one thing before we start. If you do have any questions during the course of the paper, do feed them into the chat, and we will either read them out or invite you to pose them in person after the paper. Claire, sorry.
Okay, sure, yeah. So thank you, Stephen. My talk actually is, I didn't really, it's more of a, I'll tell you what it's going to be about in a minute, but that I just want to drop the understanding divine speech from the title because I ended up not really being able to handle talking about the interpretation of these divine or angelic communications. For what I actually want to do here, I'm going to start by locating myself initially in relation to ideas expressed by Sophie and by Stephen. And as I said before, in the first place, what I want to do is a kind of angel magic version of like what a piece that Sophie wrote in this book on demonic cosmologies. And I'll be looking at some reasons why angels and other celestial entities might reasonably have been esteemed as possible conversation partners on seeing such conversation as licit. So in the second place, I want to excavate a sort of prehistory for the argument that Stephen Klukas furthered in his chapter on John Dee. In Dee's world, Klukas argues, belief in the possibility of a legitimate and pious communication with angels, a communication that had an explicitly operative dimension, was axiomatic. And he goes on to make an argument for how Dee's angel magic aligns fully with his religious beliefs and his understanding of orthodoxy. So my talk is going to show some origins of this kind of axiomatic belief in legitimate and pious angel magic in the late medieval world, from which Dee inherited his practices. And what I'd like to do is actually draw a kind of trajectory, pulling together some ideas that are common to all of these texts. And I'm going to be pushing back a little bit against the idea that Sophie Page voiced in her piece on the idea that there was an angel magic turn that essentially failed when John of Morigny's book was burned. Overall, I want to show something of the way angel magic is not merely an issue of belief in the possibility and goodness of angelic. It's not just an issue of belief in the possibility and goodness of angelic interlocutors, but it has to be understood in a framework of natural philosophy due to the fact that God is not seen as entirely discontinuous from nature, any more than he's seen as entirely discontinuous from the human. Angels are, from the perspective of much Neoplatonic theology, the knowledge-bringing intermediaries built into the cosmos for the illumination of the human mind. So late medieval thought about the problematics of the intersection between the eternal world and this world, the secular world, the world of time, is interconnected with sets of philosophical problems about the intermediary nature of angels. How do incorporeal beings talk to each other? How do incorporeal beings appear to or convey messages to the embodied? What properties do they have to facilitate their relation to the human? And underlying the address to these problems, both ritually and philosophically, is an assumption that talking to angels might not merely be possible, but would actually be necessary, maybe not just for some people, but for everyone. So how do we connect up the spaces where the pragmatics of talking to angels, which is to say the ritual practice, meets the theological and philosophical problems connected with the intersections of time and eternity that angels suggest or embody? What are the places where time meets eternity? What allows the intersection? And what rules or protocols govern the way this is allowed to happen? Briefly, the answers I want to venture are these. Time meets eternity in the stars, in the soul, and in dreams, which are influenced by the body, the soul, and the stars. What allows the intersection is the fact that the soul remains immortal, however much it's weighted down by the body. Souls themselves have boundary crossing properties. And dreams are liminal spaces that seem almost designed for access to knowledge that is half in and half out of time. The protocols for all angelic encounters are embedded in the contemplative life. The aspects of cosmology that tend to underlie implementation of angels as companions tends to be Neoplatonic and emanationist. The aspects of religious practice that intersect with these tend to be monastic type practices. There are several recurrent ideas or motifs that often emerge in discussion of angels and human access to divine knowledge. They're not always all present together, but they recur often enough to become recognizable. All of them are present and synthesized by Agrippa, but they also present singly and together in clusters in many medieval works. These ideas include the idea of the cosmos as a set of replicating images of the eternal realm, which goes along with the idea of a divine pattern or exemplar for the world and its knowledge, the world in time and its knowledge. Time replicates eternity. A part of this emanationist cosmos is the idea that divine forces are transmitted through celestial bodies and their rays and movements. Astronomical knowledge tends to be privileged and high up in the hierarchy of knowledge. And these astronomical ideas impact angel magic through image magic and Islamic philosophy also. Magic is allied to astronomy and the ability, in this context, it's allied to astronomy and the ability to understand and interpret nature and dreams. Magic may be described in positivized ways in Islamic writings. Angels are often understood as separated or disembodied substances, and they may be associated with the planetary spheres. The idea that the human being itself is a little world that's an image of the eternal, a microcosm, and the soul is part of that microcosm is a recurrent idea. The soul vivifies the body and it's destined for eternal life, and it's hence liminal. The idea that for a person who is virtuous, chaste, and obedient, which are qualities usually aligned with the monastic or religious profession, mediated forms of divine knowledge are more likely to become available. Such people have privileged access. So I'm going to talk about this cosmos a little bit, starting with, I'm going to move from a discussion of the Timaeus to kind of scholastic philosophy, and from there to Al-Kindy. I'm going to talk about Al-Kindy a little bit, and then move to the discussion of John of Morigny, and sort of land on, point forward to John Dee from the end of this. So let me start with Timaeus and the idea of time as a mirror of eternity. Here's a passage from Timaeus where the demiurge constructs the world of time and motion, and he says, so as the model was itself an everlasting living thing, he set himself to bringing this universe to completion in such a way that it too would have that character to the extent that was possible. Now, it was the living thing's nature to be eternal, but it isn't possible to attach the eternal nature fully to anything that is begotten. And so he began to think of making a moving image of eternity. At the same time as he brought order to the heavens, he would make an eternal image moving according to number of eternity remaining in unity. This image, of course, is what we now call time. In this passage, time itself is an image of eternity, housing everything in it, but in a kind of miniature, and it's in a mirror that's not itself eternal. It quickly becomes clear that there's a key connection between the invention of time and the invention of the motions of the planets in the heavens. And here they are again, here's the Timaeus again. For before the heavens came to be, there were no days or nights, no months or years. Time then came to be together with the universe. Such was the God's design for the coming to be of time, that he brought into being the sun, the moon, and 5 other stars for the begetting of time. These are called wanderers, and they came to be in order to set limits to and stand guard over the numbers of time. The Platonic exemplar for time is thus the eternal world, itself atemporal, but providing a formal model as well as generator for the world of time. In key ways, living things come into being in relation to the motion of the planets that enable them to exist in time. So we have the whole chain right here in the Timaeus, and this is something that flows through the Islamic philosophy and flows right into a lot of 12th century and 13th century writings as well. I want to flash forward now about a millennium and a half to point to some medieval examples that incorporate an understanding of an atemporal and aspatial model, or sort of moving image of eternity derived from the eternal realm, but capable of informing the human world. The first is found in the philosophical epic, the Cosmographia, written by Bernard Sylvestris between 1145 and 1148. This example is not allied to magic, but it helps to situate the idea of the human being in relation to the time-bound and eternal realms. In this Platonic creation story, a task has been enjoined by Nous, the first emanation of the divine mind, upon the three female characters who are also emanations of Nous, but lower down on the chain, Urania, Physis, and Natura. And they are supposed to create the first man, the first human being who's male. To accomplish this, Urania, the muse of astronomy, is charged with the composition of the soul. So there's a direct link between astronomy and the soul here. Physis is charged with the composition of the body, and nature with the formative uniting of the soul and body through the emulation of the order of the heavens. So again, the heavens are imitating the eternal realm, the body is imitating the heavens. The protagonists are given three gifts to help with their task. Urania receives the mirror of providence, nature, the table of destiny, and Physis, the book of memory. All three gifts are similar sorts of models, each geared in its focus to the task that that character has. But the most interesting to us here, because of its relation to the creation of the human soul, is the mirror of providence. And I quote from Bernard Sylvestris here, "The mirror of providence was of vast circumference and boundless breadth, its surface extending forever. There lived ideas and exemplars not born in time and destined not to pass away in time. This mirror of providence is the eternal mind in which resides that unfathomable understanding, that intellect which is the creator and destroyer of all things. Among the exemplars might be discovered the model of anything of whatever sort in its quality and quantity and when and how it had come to be. The model of the soul is thus represented as a model of the eternal world conjoined to the body in the emulation of the order of the heavens. The emulation of the heavens leans on the idea that the soul is also being conjoined to time. So it's a piece of eternity that's stuck together with time, governed by the heavens. And the coupling with time actually belongs to nature, though the soul itself does not. We get one step closer to the angels revealing prophetic knowledge to the virtuous in scholastic discussions of the mirror of eternity, which is kind of a related idea to the ones that I've been talking about. The idea of a mirror is handy because, partly because of its analogy to various biblical mirrors. It's handy for Christian theologians, I mean. As well as the idea of the world of time being a mirror to divine forms in the Timaeus. Thomas Aquinas, anyway, has a discussion in the Summa of whether prophets see in the mirror of eternity, which he equates to a certain book of prescience. It's mentioned by Gregory the Great. His answer is a qualified yes, as long as we understand that what the prophets are seeing or reading, if you want to understand this mirror as a sort of book, is a formal representation of things in the mind of God and not an actual eternal mirror, and it's not the mind of God itself. This is also a concern for Albert. So there's a concern that the way prophets see is not directly seeing into the mind of God, because you're not supposed to do that while you're alive. It's not supposed to be possible. How do they see divine things? They see them in this mediated form that belongs to this idea of the emanationist cosmos, that there are these like representations that go down of the entire cosmos, one of which is in the human body and soul. Albert the Great brings up the mirror of eternity in a couple of loci, including his De Prophetia and his commentary on the mystical theology. As with Thomas, the mirror is depicted as a mediating image that reveals the shape of God's thought. for living beings who cannot yet look upon God's face. But for Albert, the concept helps to explain not only prophecy, but also divination by dreams. Here is what he writes in the commentary on the mystical theology. Now, the things of God cannot be learned from any kind of probable or necessary inferences from first principles. So if the mind is to know the things of God, it needs the lights of the angelic intellect to come to it, which affects a variety of appearances in our souls in which the things of God are seen, reflecting the way in which these appearances exist in the angels themselves, as was explained in the celestial hierarchy. The philosopher, too, says in his divination in dreams that because they cannot be arrived at by way of any systematic speculation, the intellect receives them by being united to some higher moving powers. The soul is fortified to see the things of God by having the divine light of the angels coming down into it. And this light is called the mirror of eternity, in which the prophets saw their visions. But it is not God, it merely comes from God, and it is the equivalent of the light of the agent intellect in the case of natural knowledge. This makes it clear how it is not God himself who is seen, even in the most noble forms of contemplation. So here we have the mirror of eternity equated directly with the light of the angelic intellect, emanating from God, but accessed at a lower level. He links the light of the angelic intellect to a variety of appearances, I'm quoting from what I just read, in our souls through which things of God are seen. And this is clearly a description of news that comes in dreams. Elsewhere in his commentary on Aristotle's On Divination by Dreams, Albert connects the art of the interpretation of dreams to astrology and magic. Thus, prophecy is linked both to natural knowledge and the knowledge that comes through dreams, though it may be a purer form or one less clouded by the physiology of the seer. So you can get degrees of sort of access, always considered to be mediated access, even in the case of prophecy. Note the basic links. An intermediary representation of thought in the mind of God, accessible through angels, brings us closer to representations of the kind of epistemology we see at work in late medieval angel magic. I now want to turn to a slightly offbeat, earlier Aristotelian philosopher in the Islamic tradition, who also helps to bring medieval thinkers a compelling idea of a cosmos in which magical knowledge has a necessary place, a necessary, and I would say vital place. This is the 9th century philosopher Al-Kindy, who is a key influence on Renaissance philosophical magic, as well as on its medieval precursors. He's cited by Ficino, known to Agrippa, and also exerts on medieval philosophy a certain influence. There was one major way in which his thought seems to differ from Albert's. He does not lean on the role of angels or incorporeal spirits in the effects of nature. It is reasonably clear that he believes there are incorporeal spirits, but he strongly resists attributing natural or magical effects to angels or demons. His work on stellar rays, De Radiis, in some manuscripts called The Theory of Magic Arts, is dedicated to delineating a cosmos in which angels are basically unnecessary, since all natural effects, including those of ritual, words, figures, and sacrifices, characters, everything you use in magic, are entirely driven by forces natural forces, I will say, coming from the heavenly harmony through the stellar rays, assisted by the forces of human will and desire. God is importantly the source of the creation, the ultimate cause of all causes, but he is immobile and removed from the world of time and never adduced by Al-Kindy as a proximate cause of any effect. According to Al-Kindy, it is not to be thought of God that he himself, who is wholly immovable, can be moved at all by the prayers of humans. He notes that many people pray to angels as well as to discarnate souls of human beings, but all effects of prayers are, for him, adequately explained by the power of the heavenly harmony acting through stellar rays via the words and intents of the magus. The power of such rituals works, even though the spirits being prayed to may not really be part of what happens at all. Prayer is necessary, though, he says, because even though, and this is an oddness which I keep coming back to in Al-Kindy, even though you can't change or affect God's plan, he's kind of assuming that you'll be doing some praying. So Al-Kindy says, thus prayers must be made in connection to contingent events by human beings with devotion of mind and intense desire, because they will not lack effect, although it is possible that sometimes they would not benefit the event for which they were made. For prayers benefit something as far as we are concerned, for whom ignorance of causes engenders belief in contingency concerning the order of causes which come about from necessity. In that order, it is constituted that this or that must occur through prayers, among other causes. So God is up there factoring in prayers, and everything that's happening can be influenced by them, but only because he's already decided that they will be. So it's always a bad idea not to pray. I think this is what's being transmitted. So you do affect things, but it's not because God is actually responding to you or moving. So Al-Kindy sees the entire created order of things in time as always pertaining to God's plan, an order of causes orchestrated by the heavenly harmony and in a certain way destined to occur, though everything in the cosmos is also always very importantly enacting its own free will. Despite the fact that this cosmos is sort of seemingly mechanistic, it's also very alive. It's a cosmos in which stars, animals, objects, and perhaps spirits too have desires and will and natural proclivities interacting in every single thing that happens. Al-Kindy does refer to spirits, however, he typically introduces them with phrases like, some people think. He says, for example, there are also other human beings gifted to such an extent with a happy complexion that the natural efficacy of some names comes to their notice through reason or intellect, with their good complexion rectifying their cognition. This happens to them more frequently in sleep, but sometimes even while they're awake. It is also the opinion of many that incorporeal substances reveal many things to human beings that are made known neither to the senses nor to reason founded in sense. So there's room for spiritual creatures in Al-Kindy's cosmos, but they're not necessary to what happens. And he also has the idea that their revelatory events can happen in dreams, obviously. By the same token, so spiritual creatures may exist, but they're not necessary to what happens. By the same token, and I think this might have been part of what made this text attractive to some people, demons are not necessary either. And his cosmos is remarkably clean in the sense that all the forces in it are at once natural and divinely ordained by the cause of causes, even when you're doing magic. And he lays this out, and it's a fascinating worldview. Even absent these necessary angels, certain things remain just as true for Al-Kindy as they were for Albert the Great. It's a top-down hierarchical cosmos mediated by the heavenly harmony, by the stars above. The heavenly harmony is medial between the eternal realm, which designed it, and the realm of time, which enacts its directive. Divine illuminations are possible in sleep. Magical and ritual operations are important to the order of causes, and you have to know something about astrology to manipulate these effects. Al-Kindy essentially rationalizes religious belief, and this made him a friendly resource in certain ways for scholastic thinkers as well as philosophical magicians in the 15th century and later. Al-Kindy's writing does show a bit of tension here between the nature, like you can sort of feel that there's a seam in it where there's a little bit of stress between the immobility of the divine plan in eternity and the extreme mobility of the actions of free will in time. But in a sense, he tries to guard both as absolute. There's nothing anyone can do that God does not know about. And yet the force that moves the universe is this network of interacting stellar rays and human desires. To the extent that this tension is resolvable, it rests on the identification of meaning and power. And now I'm going to move to John of Morigny and angel magic. There is a little bit of a tension also visible in the writings of John of Morigny between the idea of the stars directing everything and the will of God knowing about it all. Otherwise put, God is much more likely in John's thought frame than he was in Al-Kindy's to be adduced as a proximate cause of earthly effects. As some of you know, or maybe all of you, I don't really know, John wrote a book called The Flowers of Heavenly Teaching over the first decade and a half of the 14th century. The core of this volume is a set of prayers and rituals for the acquisition of knowledge via angels. The knowledge conceived as divine includes the liberal arts, and indeed, the 9 arts themselves, proceeding from grammar to theology in a hierarchy associated with the orders of the angels, is treated as a sort of mirror of the divine realm, of the celestial court. His own book is also viewed as a kind of small image of the eternal realm, a medial place where the human meets the divine. The present art, he says, is a finite compendium of the infinite, a glorious miracle of reason, the imperious counsel of human and divine nature. So it's a place where the divine and the human come together. The Virgin Mary is regularly engaged. And in the commerce with the Virgin, encouraged by the prayers, other sorts of knowledge can also become available. John calls the book A Science of Dreams because it is in part a set of techniques and also principles for successful divine dream solicitation. John is also aware that these dream appearances are not the true faces of the divine. True faces do not belong to the true face of the divine. They're mediated appearances, but he understands the instability of their apparition as a concession to our earthly nature. Do not wonder, he says, that I have said the Virgin Mary and the rest appear in many forms and places, on which account it might be possible to say that it seems there's a transmutation in them, which, when according to the truth of the matter, there is no transmutation, nor shadow of vicissitude. Wherefore it must be understood thus: Christ, Mary, saints and angels, in regard to the form in which they appear to human beings, there is a confected transmutation, because they cannot appear to us in any other way. But in regard to the divine nature and essence in which they exist, they also remain in eternal perfection. And so, when they are at home, there is no transmutation nor shadow of vicissitude. John was embedded in the full range of types of magic available in France at the turn of the 14th century. He confesses to fault in using them. He made considerable use of both the nigromancy and the ars notoria. And he repurposes ritual elements from both types of texts in his own work, but he considers that there's a sort of an element that needs to be redeemed, I think, from both types. John's interest in astral magic emerged most clearly in his original book of figures in the old compilation draft, though the actual 92 figures he executed for that work had to be removed from the new compilation version in connection with an accusation in 1315 that his figures looked too much like nigromantic figures. Nevertheless, he told his followers to keep them safe and not destroy them because they had much in them that was prophetic. John himself claimed to have received the gift of the spirit of prophecy, and he promised to write a book about this later, though we have not found any surviving copy of it. From his assertions about prophecy in his own life, it appears that in John's mind, as in Albert the Great's, there's a real connection between dream divination, specifically his own techniques of dream divination, and the idea of prophecy. The 92 figures of the old compilation are mostly not preserved. However, we have 2 of them that traveled with the single known manuscript of the old compilation tradition, in which he also describes figures for the 7 planets and the 12 houses. There's additionally a list of letterings or writings to be inscribed on the figures, and these connect the figures not only to the 9 choirs of angels, but also the 7 planetary angels. And it's clear from other things in the text that he had originally prescribed the figures to be made on certain days and hours, which is typical of image magic. And now I want to give a sample of the way he allegorized his own work, because this is what shows most clearly the kinship that existed between the astronomical ideas typical of image magic and the more pious-seeming understanding of angelic light that we get in Albert, for example. And I'm quoting John of Morigny now. This is from his old compilation of figures. If we have set out that certain constellations, or in some cases planetary conjunctions, should be considered in the figures that have to be made, this is for no other reason but that it might be demonstrated openly that the faculty of reason in the human mind, which is held, augmented, and diminished by the influence of the heavenly bodies, should in every way be conjoined to the divine reason, the spiritual understanding, or indeed transmuted into it. Again, because we have set out that one is to pray in accordance with the planets, signs, and houses, following the solar calendar and the states of the planets in their signs. This is in order that the human nature may be seen wholly to follow divine nature and to be ruled by it in such a way that, in exercising this art, no power may be attributed to the body over the soul, but rather power is attributed to the soul over the body. And in this, following the course of sun and moon, fixing those things which are transitory in those which are eternal, namely the Son of Justice, our Lord Jesus Christ. So here John translates the idea of the medial heavens, the structure of the heavens that we see in Islamic philosophy and in Arabic image magic, into a Christian, part of a Christian anagogical allegory about the uplifting of the soul to God. This passage does not occur in the new compilation text. The astrological instructions are removed along with the figures themselves. But even in the old compilation, he veers off from the premises of astromagic, where he goes on to say that if you make a mistake in your astronomical calculations and you have constructed a figure accidentally in the wrong time or at the wrong hour, you don't have to erase them or redo them, but just let the Virgin Mary know and ask her to confirm them and tell her you made a mistake, and she will say, and it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. So there's a kind of divine override that can come into the picture at any point, and this seems to be there in order to resolve, I think, the tension between this pious science of dreams depending on angels and the power of the stars. I mean, what it really does is draw attention to the fact that there's a little bit of tension there rather than, but in ritual terms, it's an override that allows that tension to be overcome if you make a mistake. Despite this, or maybe, I'm not sure if I need to say even despite this, I don't know how you feel about what I just said, there's really nothing unorthodox about the basic premises underlying John's prayers, in which he is concerned with petitioning for knowledge insofar as it is necessary to human salvation. And he makes, every time he talks about, what you can give sort of protocols for talking to the Virgin, he makes it clear that she will answer you only if the knowledge that you're requesting is necessary to salvation. And this is part of the rules of the game, is that what it means if she answers you is that you have asked the right sort of question. It's a kind of knowledge that she considers you to need. So there's a heavy leaning on the divine predisposition throughout this as well. The idea of angelic companionship is a monastic commonplace, really. So this sort of practice that John has designed fits very comfortably into his monastic profession. And he did try to make it available to people beyond the monastic sphere. He wanted it to be usable by anyone. And we know this because he includes instructions for teaching it to people like old folks going blind, boys that have no education, boys with some education. There are protocols for all of these ways of passing on this monastic type practice into the community. Now, I'm going to try to wrap up a little bit. I had in the arc, I'm trying to describe here an arc that takes us through sort of the medieval thought world and through medieval angel magic towards the kind of magic that you get in John Dee. And I wanted to include a discussion of the angelic dream solicitation text attributed to Pelagius of Majorca. But I think there's not time to go into much detail about them. Julian Veronese has written about Pelagius, as has Paola Zambelli, and there's a book that I'm lucky enough to be gifted called Black Abbot White Magic, which actually includes some translations. These are done by there's something called the Holy Diamond Project. That's an online resource that is done by Frater Atcher, which is marvelous, shows the manuscripts in the Leipzig collection alongside transcriptions of the German and translations into English. And this is part and sort of offshoot of that project. And the texts themselves, as I said, they're really remarkable. They include rituals for contacting your own guardian angel, for different forms of dream incubation. Angels are very active, and there's a very strong possibility, or at least a fairly strong one. I don't think there's like Julian Veronese acts just beside, I think he treats Pelagius as his own guy. There's a strong possibility that he is actually a mask for, or persona for Trithemius. So, but at the same time, they're written. I mean, the fiction is beautifully complete. The fiction that this is a real person, if it is a fiction. These texts, anyway, what I want to say about them is they're very much in the same thought world that I've just been describing. John of Morigny inhabiting a thought world in which angelic communication, which is a part of monastic practice, and sort of monastic thought all the time, not just when they're doing angel magic, is bolstered by ideas of image magic that come through the Islamic tradition and kind of create this world in which angels are a necessary resource of transmitting divine and stellar knowledge to human beings. So Pelagius, and we can place him pretty securely somewhere between the end of the 15th and the early 16th century, first half of the 16th century anyway, seems to me like a sort of interesting link in the trajectory I'm trying to describe that moves towards John Dee. He inhabits the same vein of angelic knowledge solicitation that we see in John of Morigny, certainly. All of these practices are bent on the perfection of human souls through angelic information. All of them see humanity itself as key to the cosmos. It's the human being is the leak, as it were, where eternity in the form of the soul meets time in the form of the body. And human beings are made in such a way that not only is it naturally possible for the soul to be illuminated by intellectual light coming from angels, it's actually a necessity to seek them out. Now, the existence of these texts after John of Morigny, to me, makes it problematic. This isn't the only thing, but makes it problematic to talk about the failure of the angelic turn with the burning of John's book, since obviously people are just going on doing this. In John of Morigny, I will remind everyone, all of the manuscripts that we have of his work are made for use. They're made by people who have personalized the manuscripts, put their own names in the prayers and in the images where images exist. And all of them post-date the burning, every single one. We don't have any manuscripts that date from before the burning, and they come from all over Europe. So this is a practice that was very actively in use, mostly by religiosi, in the time period between 1315, when the manuscript was first condemned, and 1522, which is the latest manuscript that we have. So it looks to me like there was absolutely no relation between the dying out of this practice and the condemnation of it. No relation at all. If there's a relation in the dying out of the practice between any two things, it's the relation between what possibly Catholicism and Protestantism, because it's a very Catholic practice, and the relation between handwriting and print, because actually copying the book by hand is a part of the practice. So it doesn't transmit well into print, since you got to make a copy of it in order to use it. I think that these practices and this kind of pattern of thought, emanationist thought, I guess you can call it, is very active and is the key to this axiomatic belief in the goodness of angelic communication. So I think there's a lot to talk about in this, because obviously my trajectory suggesting that this is all very, it can be seen as orthodox. I think it's arguable that this is orthodox, but I mean, perhaps in terms of practice, it's something that kind of teeters on the edge or the verge of orthodoxy. But nevertheless, it's very alive and very active, and I don't think that it can be said to have failed, particularly as I've still got people interested in doing it. But anyway, there's a lot to talk about. We can talk about demons. I do have some images that come from John's text if you want to see them, but I'm happy to open it to any questions that people have.